Okay, this is chapter 23, and we're going to be actually looking at the second macroeconomic model. So the first one was in the previous chapter, and that was the solo growth model. In this, what we're looking at here is called the aggregate expenditure model. And what we're looking at here are the determinants of expenditures in the economy. So the idea here is that we're looking for equilibrium. Where does the economy, we know that there's a business cycle that exists, but how is it that it's getting that sort of regularity where it does well and then it does poorly? And why is it then generally improving over time? So what we're looking at here is the determination of equilibrium in expenditure. So we're looking at spending, and we're going to connect that, and we're actually going to derive a curve. We're going to determine a curve called the aggregate demand curve. Now the aggregate demand curve, I mean, you can kind of tell how it's going to be shaped. It's going to be shaped a lot like the regular demand curve. But the reasons why it's shaped like that are very different than why the demand curve is downward sloping. So keep that in mind. This is going to be the most difficult chapter for this part. And it's probably going to take me, this is probably going to be a 5-part video. There's just a lot of material to cover here. So keep that in mind. What I did try to do is I can kind of organize this chapter into 4 big parts. And I'm going to just kind of list those so you can kind of follow along with what we're doing here. Sorry, it's just kind of like you're watching me writing on a board here, but I don't come completely prepared for everything right away. Okay, I think component, investment, let's just look at the return. Actually, let's make it 3 parts. So in the first part of this, we're just going to look at the AE model as a whole, the aggregate expenditure model as a whole. We're going to look at the components of aggregate expenditures, and then we're going to use this part to derive the aggregate demand curve. So let's start. In terms of what the AE model does, the aggregate expenditure model does, is one of the key assumptions is that it's going to hold the price level constant. Important to keep that in mind because we're going to change that by the end of this chapter to derive the aggregate demand curve. But for right now, we're going to presume that the price levels are held constant, and we're just looking at spending. And we're looking at the relationship between spending, the amount that's actually spent, versus real GDP, which is production. So we're comparing spending to production. And what we're going to start, one of the things that we want to start to create here is, in looking at the AE model, so this part 1 here, we want to start to derive even the aggregate expenditure model, look at what determines that. To do that, we're actually going to create something called the Keynesian cross from John Maynard Keynes. So let's look at this here. Let's start to talk about Keynes. So I gotta find my eraser. So for the Keynesian cross and for the aggregate expenditure model as a whole, what Keynes basically said is that spending is equal to consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. But this investment is a very particular kind of investment called planned investment. And there's going to be another part which is unplanned investment, which is going to play a role here in the fluctuations in this economy. If you remember back from my earlier lecture, I said that Keynes, one of the things that Keynes talked about in terms of GDP, most of the fluctuations in the economy were caused by unplanned investments. It's going to play a part here, or changes in inventories. Now, what we can, in terms of these inventory levels, when planned investment is greater than actual investment, right? So the actual amount that ended up being investing is less than the planned investment, then what this would tend to mean is that inventories would start to rise. Inventories would rise because basically what we'd be saying here is that the level of spending is less than the level of production as measured by the GDP. So if we're producing more than is being spent, inventories would have to rise. Conversely, let's keep it like this here. If planned investments are less than actual investments, so what firms had planned to spend in terms of investments, meaning their actual production, is less than what was actually invested, then the inventory levels would tend to fall. This would basically mean that spending was greater than production. So you'd have to start to draw down stuff you built in a previous time period. Now, equilibrium, where there'd be no tendency for change, well, that's going to occur when aggregate expenditures, spending, is equal to production, as measured by GDP. So Keynes basically said, okay, we're going to have a point where there's an equilibrium in the economy, and 2 points where things are changing. Now, right, when we look at that, let's draw this out. Then what we could start to draw here is aggregate expenditures. That's my spending. Here's my production, real GDP. And now I drew a 45-degree line. Because at a 45-degree line, right, if these had the same magnitudes here, right, when this is 1, then that would be 1. And we know that all of the equilibriums, any equilibrium would have to exist somewhere along that point. Right? Because, again, if this was 1, then equilibrium would require that this be 1. 20, and 20, and so on and so forth. Now, let me draw this out and then explain why this is the case. Let's make... It's not incredibly important what I'm going to assume here. It's going to make just things a little simpler. Let's presume that it's a closed economy, so there's no net exports. Then we could draw an aggregate expenditure line, which is equal to consumption plus investments plus government spending. Now, it starts at a non-zero point, because even when production levels are 0, there has to be some positive consumption. And this has a slope as given by the consumption function. So the consumption function we're going to see depends on the level of income to the extent of the marginal propensity to consume. We're going to look at that in a short bit here. But now, what becomes quite different is on the aggregate expenditure line, we're looking at the, in this case here, looking at the inventory levels, right? And how much of those inventory levels are actually being drawn down. Our actual investment versus our planned investment, which is given by GDP. Okay, your eye should naturally be drawn to right here. At that point, inventory levels would not be changing at all. But now, as I did in a similar picture here, in the solo growth model, what's happening in scenario 1 and what's happening in scenario 2? In scenario 1, what we see here is that actual spending is greater than production. Actual spending is greater than production. What happens to inventory levels? Inventory levels would start to fall, right? Because people are buying more stuff than is being produced. So how do firms react then to their inventory levels being drawn down? Well, firms hire workers, they start producing more stuff. And in turn, workers spend more money. And what's happening in scenario number 2? In this case, production exceeds spending. In this kind of scenario right here then, if production exceeds spending, firms start to draw down their inventory. They don't want to build so much stuff. So they decide to start producing less stuff. And then consumers spend less. This is your equilibrium from the Keynesian cross. The Keynesian cross is going to be used here to start to talk about the aggregate demand curve. And this is the way, the Keynesian cross, which is what this picture is right here, is going to be the way that we're able to talk about how changing inventory levels change the economy. Now, I'll stop the video here and then pick it up with part 2.